So for my data science project, I'm going to be presenting on the book Freakonomics by Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner, and specifically looking at their sixth chapter, which is called "A Rashonda by any other Wouldn't a Rashonda by any other name smell as sweet?" And in effect, this chapter focuses on do names impact a child's life, or are they merely a reflection of their parents' desires for the child? So let's start by talking about a story of different lanes. And the chapter opens up by talking about how parents, the first act of a parent is naming their child, and how that often indicates what they think their child will accomplish. So in 1958, a man named Robert Lane, who lived in the housing projects of New York, decided to name his son Winner. He already had a bunch of children with already fairly typical names, but he had a special feeling about this son. 3 years later, he had another child who he named Loser. So it appears that Robert had clear visions for where his children would go. Winner would go on to succeed, while Loser would go on to fail. However, the roles were reversed. Loser Lane did in fact succeed. He went to prep school on scholarship, graduated from Lafayette College, and worked in the New York Police Department for several years. While his brother, Winner, is now in his mid-40s and has been arrested about 36 times on everything under the sun. And there are a couple other examples of parents choosing bizarre names. For example, there's a case of a girl named Temptress, a 15-year-old girl who landed in the Albany family court for being promiscuous, which neatly reflects her name. But her mother, in fact, tried naming her Tempest after her favorite character on The Cosby Show, but couldn't spell it, so she spelled it Temptress. And a thread that ties all these names together is that they all are from African Americans. So Roland G. Frere, who is a economist who graduated from Penn State and the University of Chicago and works at Harvard, decided to look at names and how they reflect the difference between white people and black people. And he thought of this by looking at the differences in races what they like for television, whereas whites usually watch shows like Seinfeld, but black people usually shy away from these. And even in cigarettes, Newports are a black brand, while Marlboro is a white brand. So he tried looking at whether distinctive black culture is a cause of economic disparity between whites or merely a reflection of this. So he modeled his study off of the Early Child Longitudinal Study, or ECLS study, and he went looking for his answer in California birth records, and he looked at every birth certificate since 1961. And this data doesn't just tell you the name of the child, but it also tells you the parents' marital status, the child's race, as well as their zip code, which tells them about economic status and also the racial composition of a neighborhood, and also their means of paying a hospital bill, again, another sign of socioeconomic status, and their level of education. And this data proves how dissimilar black and white parents are who gave their names to children. Whereas other races, like Asians and Latinos, usually choose similar names to whites, black people choose very different names. And this gap started in the 70s with the Black Power movement becoming a dominant force in urban life for black people. So the likelihood that a typical girl born in a black neighborhood in the 70s was given a name that was twice as common among black and whites by 1980, she received a name that was 20 times more common among blacks. So we can see this by looking at the whitest versus the blackest name. So for example, the number one blackest girl name, which is the name that occurs most frequently in the birth certificate records for California, is Imani, whereas the whitest girl name is Molly. So we see there's a difference between names for different races. And this brings up the question, how do names predict a child's outcome? Or is a child that's named Deshaun more likely to fail than a child named Jake? So there are these studies called audits, which have tried to measure how different people perceive different names. So a researcher sends two identical resumes that are both fake to an employer and tries seeing who they would hire. So according to an example study, if Deshaun Williams and Jake Williams sent identical resumes to the same employer, who would get the job? Jake Williams is more likely for a callback, and this implies that black names carry an economic penalty. But the issue with this is there are several flaws to this. the audit doesn't explore whether um, the employer is racist, and that's the reason they chose this, or did he reject him because Deshaun sounds like a low-income name that carries on with low education, and also since a resume is often forged, was he thinking that Deshaun might have forged his resume? So it's not a perfect example. So this is also saying if a black person is less likely to get a job, why don't they just change their name? And while this is a common occurrence, it's not too common. So this led Levitt to looking at the California birth records with a goal of saying, how much does the name matter? And he looked at this by saying that while Deshaun would have a worse life outcome than a man named Jake, it isn't the fault of their names. It's more the fault of their backgrounds. So names indicate a person's background and, more importantly, what a parent's expectations are for a child. So they looked at the birth record data and tried figuring out what the most common names were recorded in the income, whether there's a split. And they did find that. So for white people, they found that there's a huge split between income and name choices. If you look at white girls, for example, a low-income white girl is more likely to be named Ashley than Sarah, which is more of a middle-income name. And this corresponds to low-end and high-end names. And high-end names are names that occur most frequently with high-income people, and low-end are with people who occur more likely with low-income people. So you see that Amber is more likely a low-end name than Alexandra, which is a high-end name. So they then tried looking at this from education, and since education and income are very related, they were thinking that this would carry on the trend, and it did find that education often determines a child's name. So high-educated parents are more likely to choose the name Catherine versus the name Amber, which is a low-education name. And they found that this disparity in names based on education is relatively recent. So these names have shifted hard and fast in the last 40 years. It's to say that low-education parents have started choosing names like Cindy, that used to be a middle-income name in the last 40 years, and different spellings of names. So, for example, if you're spelling the name Jasmine differently, also indicate low income. So, they found that experimenting with names also has become a more common thing. So we're looking at black names. In 1990, the name Michael was the most popular name, whereas Isaiah is now in 2000. So they found that these names have become more experimental, and Freyer chalks this up to people wanting to fit in with their community. That is saying, if you're a black child, it's easier to fit in with the name Isaiah than it is Michael, as you'll be perceived to be trying to become white with a name like that. And they found that this experimenting also falls into the white category. So they figured out that names travel down the economic ladder. That's to say that high-end names in the 1980s, like, for example, Jennifer, have become lower-end as time goes on. That's to say that low-end parents pick names from higher-income sources. That explains why a name like Amber is now a low-end name, when perhaps when it first came around, it was not necessarily connected to lower income. So this has led Levitt to propose what the most popular names will be in 2015 based on the trends with names over time, and he thinks that the most popular girl's name as of 2015 will be Annika. And so basically, overall, what they figured out is that a name is not an indication of whether or not you'll be successful. As I say, if you have two high-income kids, name one Deshaun, name one Jake, Jake won't necessarily be more successful than Deshaun, but what a name does is it shows you where you're from and your background, and that is a bigger determinant of your outcome. That's why a person named Jake is more likely to succeed than a person named Deshaun. And also, over time, people, lower-income people want their kids to be successful, so they name them high-income names, which then fall out of favor with higher-income people, hence the shift in names over time. So overall, this is a very interesting survey, and it shows how important birth records can be at looking at societal changes. Thank you.